The child didn't speak to save himself. He stayed quiet to protect the people he loved. Snow fell quietly over Bronxville the night Graham Holloway collapsed. Inside the house, Christmas lights glowed softly, too calm for what had just happened. Doctors said Graham was alive, but unresponsive. Machines would breathe for him now. His 6-year-old son, Silas, stopped speaking that same night. No outbursts, no tears, just silence. The staff called it shock. Graham's friends called it grief. Only Michelle Thompson noticed something else. Silas watched everything. He flinched at noise. He moved carefully, like the house itself might break. What no one knew was that Graham could hear every word spoken around his bed. And Silas wasn't quiet because he was afraid. He was quiet because he believed speaking would make things worse. And the night he finally whispered the truth to Michelle, his father would learn that silence had been costing his child everything. Before we continue, please like, share, and subscribe, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Now let's dive back into the story. The Holloway estate had never been a quiet place. Even in winter, the house seemed to hum with energy, footsteps along polished floors, the soft clang of dishes, music drifting faintly through the halls. But days before Christmas, all of that stopped. Graham Holloway lay motionless in his grand bed, monitors flickering quietly beside him. The doctors came and went with tired expressions and vague answers. Unresponsive, they said. Time will tell. Their voices carried little conviction. Downstairs, the atmosphere shifted. Staff spoke in murmurs, moving cautiously, as though afraid to disturb something sacred. The festive wreaths and ornaments suddenly felt out of place, their cheer clashing with the tension in the air. But it was Silas who changed the most. Since the collapse, the little boy had not spoken. Not one word. He didn't cry or scream. He didn't ask what had happened. He simply found Michelle and attached himself to her like a second shadow. Wherever she went, he followed, quiet, watchful, small fingers clutching the hem of her apron. At first, Michelle assumed it was grief or fear. Maybe both. But it didn't feel like either. Silas didn't act lost. He didn't seem confused. He just watched. Quietly. Constantly. In the mornings, he stood behind her in the kitchen, eyes fixed on nothing. In the evenings, he curled beside her on the couch, his little hand resting against her side like a silent plea. Once, when Michelle carried laundry past the bedroom where Graham lay, she noticed Silas paused. He looked in long and hard, and something in his face shifted. Not sadness, not fear, something sharper. Some children don't go quiet because they're broken. They go quiet because they're listening. That thought whispered to Michelle late one night, long after Silas had fallen asleep beside her on the couch. She stared at the ceiling and repeated it again, softer. Some children are quiet because they already know what no one wants to say. She began to notice that he wasn't just still, he was absorbing everything. Graham's shallow breathing, the beeps of machines, the weight of tension in the air. It was as if he was gathering puzzle pieces only he could see. Silence isn't emptiness. Sometimes it's protection. The house itself seemed to obey this quiet. The staff avoided certain rooms. The fireplaces burned lower. Laughter was gone. The halls, once wide and warm, now felt narrow and chilled. Even the Christmas lights seemed to flicker more carefully. Michelle felt the shift deep in her bones. One night, as she tucked a blanket around Silas's shoulders, she whispered, "I wish I knew what you were thinking." He didn't reply, just kept staring into the dark. And that's when she realized he wasn't confused. He was thinking. It sent a shiver down her spine. The silence of the house wasn't accidental. It was waiting. A stillness before something inevitable. A pause between truth and consequence. And Silas, this boy who hadn't spoken in days, was standing right in the center of it. Not lost, but knowing. She thought about all the time she'd looked at him and assumed he was fragile, but now she saw something different: resolve. Focus. A heaviness he shouldn't have to carry, but did, and the truth pressed against her heart like a warning. He knows something. Maybe not in words, but in spirit. The tree lights blinked faintly in the hallway. The garland hung still over the stairs. And deep in the room upstairs, Graham Holloway didn't move. Something was coming. Michelle could feel it. Silas already had. It started with a whisper behind a door that wasn't closed all the way. Silas had only gone looking for his stuffed rabbit. The hallway near the kitchen was warm, filled with the clatter of dishes and the hum of low conversation. But as he stepped closer, voices caught his attention. Not loud ones, the kind that carry fear precisely because they try to stay quiet. "I think he just broke," a woman said. "All that pressure, the company, the image, the holidays. He was under so much stress," another voice replied. "Maybe his mind just gave out." Silas didn't breathe. He didn't blink. He stood still until the voices faded into footsteps. Then he turned and walked back upstairs, leaving the rabbit behind. That was the last time he sought out a toy. The next day, Michelle found his building blocks packed away in their bin. The day after that, his favorite red truck was gone from the windowsill. He stopped humming in the bath. He refused to play music. The jingling of bells on his bedroom doorknob was carefully removed, one by one, without a word. At first, Michelle assumed he was grieving that he couldn't bring himself to enjoy what reminded him of his father. So she tried to make gentle space. She offered him music during lunch, pulled out the old nativity set he once loved, even suggested baking cookies together. Silas only shook his head, lips pressed into a firm line. "Baby," she whispered one night as they sat by the tree. "It's okay to be a kid." But he leaned away from her touch, folding his arms across his chest like a secret. Michelle didn't understand until she caught him covering his mouth during a laugh. Not a big one, just a tiny puff of amusement when a dog outside barked and slipped on the snow. But even that sound scared him. And then it hit her. He wasn't sad. He was scared. Some children don't cry because they're strong. Some stop making noise because they think silence keeps people from leaving. He had heard those whispers, internalized them, folded them into the shape of a rule. Noise means stress. Stress means collapse. Collapse means disappearing. He was trying to make himself safe, so he shut himself down, one toy at a time, one laugh at a time, one word at a time. Michelle sat alone that evening, hands in her lap, watching the fire burn. She had seen trauma wear many masks, but this one, this child, choosing stillness to protect someone else, it cracked her open. Noise didn't break his father, she wanted to say. Silence won't bring him back. But how do you argue with a child's unspoken rule? How do you reach someone who believes that being heard means being left? She found him that night in the upstairs hallway, sitting cross-legged outside Graham's door. Not asleep, not crying, just sitting, a boy guarding a silence he thought could save his world. And in that stillness, something shifted in Michelle. Children learn strange equations in the dark. Some of them carry those beliefs forever. She sat down beside him, not saying a word, not reaching out, just letting her presence be the answer he wouldn't ask for. And as the silence deepened, one truth rose from the shadows. Something unspoken, but undeniable. The silence wasn't accidental anymore. It was a choice. The machines blinked and pulsed in quiet rhythm, their sounds calibrated to comfort. Tubes, monitors, wires all carefully arranged to maintain the illusion that Graham Holloway was unreachable, unconscious, suspended somewhere between breath and oblivion. But Graham was not gone. He had opened his eyes once, long before the doctors entered the room that first night. Just briefly, long enough to see Michelle's hand trembling as she reached for the call button, and the horror in her voice when she realized he wasn't responding. And then, he let go. Not of life, just of participation. He closed his eyes again and stayed there, motionless, blank, listening. It had started as instinct, a moment to breathe, to remove himself from the burden of decision. But as the hours passed and no one knew he was aware, something darker whispered to him. Let it play out. Let them talk. Let them show who they are when no one is watching. He told himself it wasn't manipulation. It was revelation. He would know who cared, who waited, who walked away. And so, the powerful man behind the machines made a choice. He listened. At first, it was the nurses. Their conversations drifted like leaves. "His vitals are stable today," one said. "Poor boy downstairs." Another murmured, "Can't imagine what this is doing to him." Later, it was the footsteps of staff in the hallway. Soft greetings, stiff laughter, the occasional clink of a tray being delivered with careful hands. But Graham stayed still, soaking in everything not from fear, but control. When Michelle entered the room each night, he knew it was her before she spoke. Her steps were slower, her presence gentler. She rarely stayed long, but sometimes, when Silas was near, she would sing low, old hymns, half-remembered, her voice barely a thread in the quiet. He heard them all. "Come, thou fount of every blessing," she would hum while brushing Silas's hair from his forehead, or when laying a blanket across his lap as he sat silently beside the bed. And Graham, still and listening, waited for a crack in her tone, a sign of bitterness. But it never came. Michelle was loyal. But even loyalty, he knew, had limits. He wanted to see where hers would end. Still, he said nothing, because in silence, people unravel in the open. He thought of Silas, his small frame, his noiseless days. The way the boy sat by the door like a watchdog that never barked. Graham hadn't expected that. Hadn't planned for his son to vanish into silence alongside him. And yet, he didn't speak. Power doesn't disappear when we lie still. It waits. There was a strange comfort in invisibility, the way people confessed themselves when they believed no one was listening. Graham told himself he was collecting truth, not betraying trust. But the longer he listened, the harder it became to feel untouched by the things he heard. Michelle's whispered prayers beside the bed, Silas's refusal to laugh, and somewhere in the deepest corners of that room, guilt began to stir. Still, he didn't blink. He didn't twitch. He didn't move, because seeing who stays when you disappear felt more necessary than revealing yourself too soon. He waited. The father hears everything and chooses silence. The house, dressed in gold ribbon and soft light, looked more like a memory than a home. Christmas Eve had arrived quietly. No carols, no guests, no bright conversation, just the hush of a place caught between what it used to be and what it was becoming. Michelle stood at the fireplace, straightening the stockings. They had been untouched for days. The one embroidered with Silas hung a little lower than the rest, the only one that still mattered. Behind her, Silas sat curled into the corner of the couch, knees to his chest. His eyes tracked the flicker of firelight on the wall, but he wasn't really watching. His mind was somewhere else, somewhere upstairs. She approached carefully, carrying a cup of warm milk, not because he'd asked for it, but because it felt like something normal to do. "Still warm," she said gently. He didn't move. She set it down on the table beside him and lowered herself to the rug, keeping her posture low, her voice even. "I used to think Christmas was loud, full of music and mess, and food burning in the oven." A pause. Still nothing. "But maybe quiet Christmases show you what's really in the room." She waited, and that's when it happened. A flicker. Silas's lips parted slightly, just barely. Not a yawn, not a breath. A shape forming, like a word about to surface. Michelle's heart caught in her throat. "Silas," she whispered, leaning forward. He blinked, slow, uncertain. His mouth moved again. A syllable. Nothing came out. But it was there, the intent. Trembling like a candle's edge. She leaned closer, and then he turned his head, slowly, toward the hallway, toward the staircase, toward the room at the top where machines hummed and secrets breathed. His face changed. The hope fell out of his eyes like light switched off. He shook his head, pulled his knees tighter, and turned away. Michelle didn't chase him. She didn't speak. She just sat back, the air suddenly colder. This was the moment. This was supposed to be it, but it wasn't. This is the moment most people leave, right before a child decides whether to keep hurting alone. She looked at him, not just at the smallness of his body, but the weight he was carrying. He had almost spoken. Almost. But whatever belief had wrapped itself around his heart, it was stronger than her nearness, stronger than warmth, stronger than Christmas. Children don't fear truth. They fear consequences. Somewhere deep inside him, a decision had been made, not out of anger, not even out of sadness. It was something more dangerous than both. He believed that speaking would make everything worse. Words meant noise. Noise meant stress. Stress meant collapse. And collapse meant goodbye. So he chose silence again. And in doing so, pulled the door shut on the moment that could have changed everything. Michelle stared into the fire. Her hands trembled. Not from defeat, but from realization. He wasn't waiting to feel safe. He had already chosen not to be. There was no moving forward until something broke that belief. Something louder than fear. Braver than memory. But it would not happen tonight. Tonight, silence won. The Christmas lights had dimmed to a soft glow, blinking faintly against the shadows of the ICU room. It was late, the kind of quiet that didn't feel peaceful, only tired. Michelle sat slumped in the chair beside Graham's bed, her shoulders heavy with the weight of too many nights without sleep. The machines pulsed and ticked beside her, offering no comfort, just noise pretending to be stability. Graham hadn't moved. Not once. His face was still, peaceful to anyone else. But to Michelle, it was a mask, and masks didn't comfort. She sat in silence, hands in her lap, barely blinking. The tree downstairs was still lit. She had left the cookies untouched. The child hadn't asked about presents, because some years, Christmas doesn't come. It just passes through you. She didn't hear Silas enter, but she felt him. Small arms wrapped around her neck as he climbed quietly onto her lap, pressing his forehead to her shoulder. Michelle didn't speak, she just pulled him in, steady and warm. Like a mother in a storm, she couldn't stop. He trembled, and then, in the hush of the room, he leaned close to her ear and whispered, shaking, "I think Daddy stopped loving me because I was bad." Her breath caught. He paused, then added, even softer, "So I tried to be very quiet, so he wouldn't get tired of me." Michelle's arms tightened around him instantly, her whole body curling to protect him from the very air, from the ache that had just broken through his silence like a splintered dam. "No," she whispered back, voice cracking. "No, baby. No. That's not what happened." But he was already burying his face in her sweater, ashamed, as if the pain was something he had caused, as if his small voice had ruined everything. And from the bed, the man who was supposed to be gone heard every word. Graham didn't move, couldn't, wouldn't, but the boy's voice hit harder than any blow. His son, this silent little boy, had been punishing himself for days, maybe longer, believing he had been too loud, too much, too wrong to be loved. And Graham had let him carry that weight. He had watched it happen, and done nothing. Michelle's tears were falling freely now, soaking into the boy's hair. Her hand trembled as she stroked his back, trying to hold in all the grief that had waited in both of them for far too long. In that moment, the quiet in the room was no longer peace, it was failure. And Graham, unmoving, faced it. The truth always speaks when we think no one is listening. He thought silence would protect him, thought pretending gave him power. But now it had a cost, and the price was written in his son's trembling voice, and the way the woman beside him wept without knowing he could hear her. The fake coma becomes a moral crime. It wasn't strategy anymore. It was cowardice. He had traded truth for observation, and now there was nothing left to observe, only wounds. Downstairs, a strand of lights flickered and went out. Silas had stopped shaking, but he did not speak again, and Michelle didn't ask him to, because some confessions only come once whispered when the soul can't bear silence anymore. The light in the ICU room was gray, not day, not night, just the color of in-between. The machines ticked steadily beside Graham's bed, but something had changed. The rhythm had shifted, not dramatically, just enough. A flicker on the monitor, a subtle difference in breath. Graham was awake, not just conscious, aware, but still. He didn't move. The confession from the night before echoed inside him like a tolling bell. He had heard every word. The small, cracked whisper of a child who thought he was unlovable. The quiet desperation in Michelle's voice. The shattering silence that followed. He hadn't slept. He couldn't, because what he heard, he couldn't unhear. He had told himself this was a test, a way to measure love, to observe what people did when they thought he was gone, to find out who truly stayed. But now the equation had changed. His son hadn't just gone quiet, he had turned himself into a ghost, believing that love was conditional and earned only through silence. And Graham had created the silence that taught him that. He stared at the ceiling, unmoving, letting the monitors sing their empty song. This was never supposed to happen. He had thought the quiet would reveal truth. Instead, it created a lie his child now believed, and that lie had weight. Some truths hurt because they show us who we've been. If that matters to you, don't walk away now. His breathing hitched slightly, not enough to call the nurses, not enough for Michelle to notice if she passed by. But the machines caught it. A subtle jump. A sign of life beneath the stillness. He could hear movement in the hallway now. The morning shift beginning. Dishes in the kitchen. Michelle's voice, faint. Silas's footsteps soft, careful, trained by days of fear. Graham swallowed hard. The sound scraped against his throat. The guilt wasn't theoretical anymore. It was embodied, small, fragile, and curled into the arms of a woman who hadn't stopped loving either of them, even when they gave her nothing. He wanted to sit up, to speak, to fix it, but he didn't. Not yet, because something in him still feared what would happen once he was no longer hidden. Once the veil dropped, once the people he'd watched so carefully were allowed to watch him again. So he lay still, but not out of strategy. This stillness was shame. He thought about Silas's voice, those soft, gutting words. I think Daddy stopped loving me because I was bad. It played on a loop in his head, and every time he thought he could bear it, it landed heavier. Because he hadn't just heard his son say it, he had caused his son to believe it. The monitor beeped again. The lie of his unconsciousness was running out of places to hide. Knowledge without action becomes guilt. And now, Graham knew everything. Knew what his silence had cost. Knew what his son had buried inside himself. Knew that love wasn't tested in absence. It was proven in presence. But knowing wasn't saving. Not yet. His eyes stayed closed. His mouth stayed shut. But inside, the weight pressed deeper. Because there's a line between listening and repentance, and Graham had not crossed it. The morning light wasn't dramatic. It didn't spill into the room with glory or warmth. It just arrived quiet and steady, like the way truth sometimes does. Michelle stood near the window, her hands wrapped around a lukewarm mug of coffee she hadn't sipped. The night had bled into the morning without permission. She hadn't slept. Neither had the house. Behind her, Graham opened his eyes. There was no gasp, no alarm, no sudden awakening that summoned the staff. Just a breath, deliberate, smooth, real. And this time, he didn't pretend to close his eyes again. He was awake, officially. Michelle hadn't turned around yet. She didn't see the moment it happened. But Graham saw her, and he stayed silent. Not out of strategy, just not ready. Across the room, the chair beside the bed was empty. Silas had left his blanket crumpled on the seat. A tiny stuffed rabbit sat on the armrest like it had been guarding the space overnight. And then, footsteps, small ones. Silas entered the room in socks and soft breathing, rubbing his eye with one fist. Michelle turned slightly when she heard him, and her lips parted just a bit, as if she were about to say something. But she didn't. Silas climbed up onto the chair again. Then, without looking at either of them, he whispered into the quiet, "I don't think Daddy's mad at me anymore." Michelle froze. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't meant to shake anyone. It was just a sentence, spoken like a thought left unattended. But it struck her so deeply she couldn't move. Graham heard it, every syllable, and he knew instantly. Silas didn't say it for effect. He said it because he believed it, not as a conclusion, but as a hope. Graham's throat tightened. His instinct was to reach out, to confess, to drop the act, and make it right. But instead, He looked at his son the way a man looks at a mirror, seeing the damage, seeing the softness, seeing the chance to be better if he didn't move too quickly. Michelle turned around slowly. Her eyes locked on Graham's. No surprise. No scream. Just a quiet shift behind her gaze, as if part of her had known this moment would come, and the rest of her had prepared to stay anyway. She didn't speak. She didn't walk away. And Graham, for once, didn't fill the silence. Mercy rarely arrives with noise. The sunlight moved across the floor, slow and weightless. Michelle set down her mug. She crossed to Silas and gently brushed his hair back, her fingers steady, her breath calm. No one said what had just changed. No one named the lie. No one demanded explanation. But it ended, right there. Not with a crash, not with an apology, just with a boy's soft voice and a woman's decision to stay. Graham watched it all, still silent. Not because he had nothing to say, but because something inside him knew that whatever came next had to be real, not forced by guilt, not rushed by fear, not spoken to save face. Just real, and real things don't always arrive loud. No confrontation, just awareness. He laid his hand gently on the edge of the blanket beside Silas's foot. The boy didn't flinch. That was enough. Snow fell in slow, deliberate spirals beyond the front window. It didn't stick at first, just danced in the cold morning light, as if the sky itself wasn't sure if it was ready to settle. Graham stood by the window, one hand resting lightly on the frame. He wore a sweater Michelle had laid out hours ago, and socks with the hospital tag still clinging to the edge. The machines were gone now. The lie was over. But the silence it left behind had weight. Behind him, Michelle sat in the armchair, legs curled beneath her, a mug of tea growing cool on the end table beside her. She hadn't said much since the morning. Graham opened his eyes and chose not to speak, but also chose not to hide. She hadn't left. And Silas stood just a few feet away, watching the snow. His small figure outlined by the soft glow of the Christmas tree that hadn't been turned off yet. He didn't fidget. He didn't smile, but his shoulders were looser now, like something had begun to lift, even if it hadn't gone away. Graham turned slightly, just enough to see them both in his peripheral vision. No script, no explanation, just a need. I'm sorry. The words dropped between them like snowfall, quiet, but impossible to ignore. He didn't try to explain, didn't reach for reasons or wrap himself in the word stress. He didn't name the lie or try to undo what had been done. He just stood there, facing the boy who had believed his father's silence was punishment earned. I thought I was testing the people who loved me, Graham said, voice low. But it wasn't a test. It was cruelty. And I'm sorry. Silas didn't move right away. He stared at the snow as it began to coat the edge of the windowsill. Then, slowly, he looked up, just once. His gaze met his father's, and he nodded. Not a gesture of full forgiveness. Not yet. Just a beginning. A space made for something new. Michelle didn't interrupt. She didn't smile. She didn't offer some warm line to tie it all together. She just stayed, a witness, the kind of presence you don't always notice until you realize it never left. They stood in that quiet, the kind that had once hurt, but now felt like a room where healing might eventually live. Graham didn't ask for anything more. He turned back to the window, hands still on the frame, not holding it for balance, holding it like someone remembering they're allowed to feel. Some stories don't ask for applause. They ask us to stay. If protecting children still matters to you, remember this one. Outside, the snow thickened. Inside, the Christmas lights blinked one last time before going dim. They didn't make plans. They didn't open gifts. The day passed slowly, without fanfare. But when Michelle tucked Silas into bed that night, he whispered, "I want Daddy to sing next time." She kissed his forehead, pulled the blanket to his chin, and whispered back, "I think he's ready." And down the hall, Graham sat in silence, not afraid of it anymore, not hiding in it, just holding it carefully like something he'd once broken and now hoped to carry better. Not every miracle restores what was lost. Some only teach us how to stop causing harm. The snow kept falling. The silence remained, but this time, it didn't feel like the end. It felt like grace.